If we can take our seats, please, for the second of today's COP sessions. So I'm really conscious that some people are here for the full day, so you'll already know what we're doing, and some people are just coming in for the sessions. So what we're running today is a COP-style event, and what that means is we've got some expert speakers who are bringing ideas and recommendations. There's then an opportunity for our panel at the front, who I'll introduce in a moment, to ask questions, and for the audience to ask questions. And then our panel will take a vote on those recommendations. Is this something that we should be doing in Orkney? And this second of today's COP sessions is on food from the land and food security. And anybody who lives on an island knows that food security has always been an issue for us. We know when the ferries are disrupted, the supermarket shelves are empty. But what we're increasingly seeing is new threats. So the ransomware attack on Co-op this year also saw food not on our shelves. So today the focus is on food security. I'm going to start off by introducing our panel. So if you just want to do a one-sentence introduction.
Hello, I'm Alexander Arnold. I'm a farmer from South Ronaldsay and quite an interest in technology and development and renewables.
Hello, I'm Aisling Phillips. I was born and raised on Hoy. I have a beef farm, but I've also been working around climate and community development in and around Orkney for the last 3 years.
Hello, I'm Finn McLeod. I run a small software development team, mostly based here in Orkney.
Hi, I'm Adele Lidderdale. I'm an islander. I've worked in the energy industry here for 10 years or so, but I'm also interested in policy.
Thank you. And I'm now going to introduce our two speakers. We have speaking today Dr. Henry Creissen, and Henry is the director of the Institute of Agronomy and Agriculture here at UHI in Orkney. His expertise includes applied plant pathology, integrated pest management, agroecology and social sciences. And the Institute collaborates with farmers, with growers, with end users and research organisations to improve the efficiency and resilience of crop production systems in the Highlands and Islands. Welcome. And we've also got with us Ed Bollom. And Ed has been working as a professional gardener for over 20 years, specialising in productive horticulture and kitchen gardens. Ed was the kitchen gardener at King Charles's Highgrove House for more than 5 years, and then head gardener at Gordon Castle Walled Garden, which is one of the largest walled gardens in Europe, for 10 years. So welcome, and handing over to Henry.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the food that Orkney currently produces and what it could produce. Different to many of the Scottish islands, Orkney is very much agriculture as opposed to crofting, particularly the mainland. The system is really an intense grazing system, intense grassland, and that's to support largely our beef cattle. We have the highest density of beef cattle in Europe. We have about 75,000 on the isle and about twice as many sheep as well. So most systems will have beef and sheep in Orkney. As I said, it's predominantly based on an intensively managed grassland system. We also grow a decent amount of barley, about 400 holdings of barley. And that's spring barley for grain, for predominantly animal feed, but also straw for their bedding as well. So, we've got a lot of cows, we grow a decent amount of barley, we have the sorts of crop protection issues you might normally encounter in such intensive systems, particularly dealing with docken and thistles. There's some advances there that we've been involved in, particularly looking at ways that we might be able to minimise herbicide use through targeting the docks and not spraying the rest of the field. There's been significant savings there. We've also got some unique crop protection challenges. Resident and migratory geese, they eat a lot of grass and also can cause issues transferring disease to livestock and sometimes humans as well, potentially. The Institute in the past has focused quite heavily on the premium drinks sector. The work has been with gin and whiskey, to growing berries and botanicals, blueberries, cranberries, even some more bizarre crops such as salal and chokeberry. Even tea at one point. This was some work that my predecessor did with a lady on Chaplaincy, setting up a tea business, tourism related. A lot of the work that was done previously has been with an old barley that's potentially been grown on the islands for 4,000 or 5,000 years. This is called bear barley. You can see the picture on the right compares bear barley to a modern variety. It's taller, produces a lot of great straw, which is of high value in Orkney. It's also, crucially for Orkney, it's able to be harvested 2 or 3 weeks before modern varieties, which in some years can be a real significant advantage, particularly, for example, last year it was very wet towards the back end of the year. We managed to get our bear harvested without too much bother. Later in the year there were more issues around harvest. And that's something we're constantly looking for up here, because a lot of the crops that have been grown throughout the UK are being bred, really where I grew up, in sort of the east of England, particularly sort of cereals, and they perhaps are not well adapted to our environment. We currently face significant problems that we in agriculture are well placed to address. This is dealing with sort of mitigating and adapting to climate change, reducing loss of biodiversity and enhancing it where possible, whilst at the same time trying to achieve food and drink security. This has been dubbed the agricultural trilemma. How are we trying to resolve some of these issues? Well, one key aspect of our research is to develop more resilient crops. That bear barley I mentioned before, we're working with the James Hutton Institute, crossing that bear barley with modern varieties and looking at their progeny and how they perform in the field, particularly trying to hone in on genetic regions, even specific genes responsible for tolerance to high pH and low nutrient soils. This work particularly on manganese. We're investing in our soils, and most typical Orkney crop rotation will be 2 consecutive spring barley crops and then back into grass for maybe 10, 12 years. Between those spring barley crops, we basically have half the year where there's nothing on that field. It's a bare field. By sowing crops, cover crops, catch crops, green manures, essentially something it's not a cash crop, we can protect the soils, cover the soils with a green living root, hold on to some of the nutrients, prevent some of the damage that could be caused by our high winds and heavy rainfall over the winter months. And by doing that, protecting the soils, we look after the biodiversity within the soil, the functional microbial biodiversity, but also can potentially add in a bit more nitrates and hold on to phosphorus and potassium. Therefore, that crop, potentially, that field will potentially require less synthetic inputs. And when we're talking about emissions from agriculture, we're primarily talking about enteric methane emissions from ruminant livestock and nitrous oxide emissions from fertiliser production and application. Increasing the diversity of crops that we've grown is another part of the remit of the Institute. So moving away from just being sort of grass. There's a big diversity in the type of grasses we're talking about. I'm lumping them all together here, but there's all different types of mixtures of grasses and clovers, and the way that it's managed, whether it's for grazing, for silage, there's lots of different forms of grass. But we're looking at ways that we might be able to grow more crops to sustain our intensive beef production systems, but also keep people healthy on the islands as well. And part of the way we're doing that is by investing in controlled environment agricultural systems. So today, as we speak, we're putting in a tower farm, which I'll get onto a bit later, which is an aeroponic system, so a soilless system that will allow the production of high-quality fruit and veg on the island. This is in a polycrub situation, so taking advantage of structures we already have in the island. We're seeing this research as being potential to be scaled up across the Isles. So we can get rid of some of these issues that we have in terms of the delay from being picked to arriving on our islands, and also the food miles and everything else that's associated with that. And then, crucially, we must protect our crops from pests, weeds and diseases, and we're looking at more cost-effective, but also sustainable solutions to that in a process known as integrated pest management. So through all these sort of aspects of our research, we're gearing up for a more sustainable, productive future in Orkney. So I mentioned the work we're doing breeding bare barley. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll see a modern variety grown in the 2 rows down the middle. That's looking quite poorly on this high pH site, which locks up a lot of micronutrients. We've got the bare barley on the left, which is a nice healthy green colour, and we've got the progeny of them on the right as well, so it's somewhere in between. This year we planted a full population of this cross between modern variety and bare. So we had 1,440 mini plots at our site in Bury. As you can see, there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of difference in the traits here between the different mini plots. Some are tall, some are short, some are flowering already, some are not, some won't. There's a lot of difference in terms of disease resistance, nitrogen use efficiency, and crucially, as I mentioned, earliness. So when we harvest this crop is crucial for Orkney. We don't have that flexibility you have further south. Really good resource there for us to start asking some interesting questions about how we can adapt barley so that it's more able to grow on our more marginal soils and in our potentially harsher environments and a short growing season. We're also doing more research into oats. This is a spring oat trial we have at the college this year. And again, thinking about that selection for early maturity, this is work we're doing with Scandinavian partners. So we're testing out material that's been bred in places like Sweden, Norway, Iceland, for its suitability for Orkney. These trials are being conducted across all of this region, from right the way down to Wales, right the way up to Lapland in Finland, so we can assess the traits and the underlying genetics that are responsible for a good oat in that environment, leading to future breeding programs that can take advantage of that trait and genetic information. As you can see here, there's quite a bit of difference in terms of maturity date. See, some of the ones in the middle are basically ready to be harvested at the time of this photo, whereas some are still very green. There's a good few weeks in terms of maturity date, and that could be really crucial for, again, avoiding the bad weather at the end of the year when you're trying to harvest, but also spreading the workload for the farmer as well. You don't want everything to be doing at the same time on the farm. So having a bit of a way in, maybe do some oats, then some bare barley, and then some more oats, then some modern variety of barley, is a way of sort of keeping the system productive throughout the season, and also hedging your bets as well. It's more, the more diverse the system, generally the more resilient. We could take that a step further as well by looking at like mixtures of crops. So this is, on the left, an intercropping system where you have multiple species grown together. So here it's ryegrass, red clover, spring barley and spring oats, and this would be treated as an arable silage. This would be cut around that sort of time, baled, and used as a high energy and high protein feedstock for livestock. We're also looking at ways we can diversify within the landscape that we have here. Increasing the amount of species we have in grass clover lays is one way of ensuring that resilience that is conferred by diversity, but also we're getting all kinds of beneficial effects in terms of bringing nutrients into the system. When we've got legumes, we can fix atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into a form that's available to plants. There's also all kinds of benefits for biodiversity both above and below ground, as well as potentially having another feedstock for your livestock. Lots of people will be looking to put sheep on fields at the back end of the year, and these sorts of mixtures are perfect for that. Earlier I mentioned cover crops, so these are sown outside of the main cash crop window. This year we're putting in various different cover crops to protect the soil and improve the soils. It's a brassica-focused mix, which gives it good grazing potential as well, thinking about that want of many to put sheep on at the back end of the year. So we have things like stubble turnip, leafy turnip, rape kale hybrids, and the common vetch as well, as the legume component. We're testing these out in large strips at the college this year, 200 metre long by 6 metre wide strips. All of the individual species and also the mixtures as well, to see if we can find something that's going to perform well and ideally consistently in Orkney. We're also giving out this mixture that we've developed to about a dozen interested farmers who are testing out different ways of establishing the crop, some of which will be broadcasting into a standing crop a couple of weeks before it's harvested, but most will be sort of, drilled in or scattered on the fields after the barley straw has been removed. This is a really important time to start doing this work because previously farmers have not needed to do this to get their basic farm payments. There's only about 10 farmers that need to do something like this, an ecological focus area at the moment. Next year in Orkney that's going to go up to about 230. So there's going to be a lot more people growing these sorts of things. So this is going to change the landscape as well. I mentioned these tower farms that we're putting in at the college, these aeroponic systems. This is going in to our polycrubs. It could go into polytunnels. It could go anywhere, really. It's a very flexible, low-input system, and you can grow pretty much anything on it, from trees, strawberries, herbs, high-value stuff that doesn't travel so well and is highly nutritious will be the main focus of our research. We'll have supplementary lighting, which will turn on towards the end and the start of the season, just to extend the growing season by a couple of months. And doing that even further with using these seedling tents. So rather than heating a whole polytunnel and lighting a whole polytunnel or polycrub, we can get the seedlings established in these systems where everything is controlled with your phone, the temperature and humidity and everything like that, so that when the growing conditions in the polycrub become more favourable, gets a bit warmer and a bit sunnier, we're ready to go. We can transplant those seedlings out into those towers and keep that system going throughout the growing season. Yeah, I mentioned earlier that lots of people are going to have to do these ecological focus areas. Policy and regulations do drive a lot of farming decisions, and it's likely that of the options that are available, the ones that I think are probably going to be most readily uptaken in Orkney are around sort of green cover crops, catch crops, so multiple crops together with more flowering crops in there as well. Legumes such as clovers and that will do well up here. Pulses, so like beans and peas, notoriously variable crops in Scotland and particularly up here. Most people I've met that are growing peas on the island are growing a mixture of grass and peas and then cutting that and wrapping it and using it as silage as well as a more reliable way of growing the crop. If you were growing peas for human consumption, there are lots of restrictions in place and lots of risk, which is why most people grow as a cooperative when they're doing that further south. So that's what we're doing at the college to try to sort of tackle this agricultural trilemma of growing better crops in more sustainable and productive systems, and then also now starting to invest more in that horticultural component of our diets, which leads me on nicely to Ed's talk. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Right, thank you very much, Henry. That was really fascinating. It's lovely to be here again. I was here last year talking about my previous life, which was looking after a huge walled garden over on the mainland. For people who aren't, most of you guys are probably islanders, but from my point of view, I was really amazed when I first came over at how fertile the islands are. I was really shocked compared to some of the other Scottish islands. It seems that you guys have got everything here that you need to grow an amazing variety of crops. And initially I thought with this talk maybe I could talk about what people could grow in their various different situations on the islands, but actually having visited a lot of community gardens and projects back in March, I've kind of realised that there's almost no limit to what you guys can grow. And obviously shelter is the biggest one, but what's nice about small-scale gardening is that you can actually change the environment to suit the crop. So I think a lot of what Henry was talking about is changing the crop to suit the environment. But on a smaller scale, we've got the luxury of being able to actually manipulate the environment a little bit and grow a huge diversity of fruit and vegetables, herbs, medicinal plants, that kind of thing. So I'm going to talk about various different ideas that we've got to support small-scale self-reliance in remote communities. You can see a few on the slides here. We've got the wonderful community garden in Stromness, which is fantastic, well worth a visit. Quite a big site, all sorts of interesting ideas and ways of growing crops, and they're right up on the top of a hill, so a really exposed site. Then we've got the lovely little polycrub at the primary school on North Ronaldsay. Very small project, but get the children involved. I don't know how many children there are in the primary school, just a handful, but it's so important to get kids involved in this kind of thing. Then we've got St Coombs just down the road. Not only do they have these fantastic growing facilities, they've also created their own way of selling their produce via their cafe. And then the wonderful setup at the Balfour, which I'm sure quite a few of you guys know. So I'll just talk a little bit about my background. I studied sustainable horticulture at Cannington College in Somerset about 25 years ago. And then the past 20 years I've been working in historic gardens on these big grand estates, specialising in the walled kitchen gardens. And I think what's really interesting is that these traditional gardening skills are still being practiced on these estates. And of course these estates are communities, and the gardens are used, traditionally they'd be used for, dukes and duchesses, kings and queens, the aristocracy, but also they would have been used to feed the staff, to feed guests. I think quite often the owners of these gardens think that their produce goes entirely to them, but I can tell you 100% that the gardeners are pretty well fed from these places as well. So I've worked at places like Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. I spent 5 years as the kitchen gardener to the King at Highgrove, which is entirely organic and a really interesting place to work, because there's very few fully organic gardens of that scale in Britain. There's actually surprisingly few. And what I really learned from there is that organic gardening isn't a new thing by any means at all. If you look in some of the much older gardening books, that's where all these techniques come from, because we didn't have all this modern technology. And I think traditional gardening skills are so relevant today, just as much as they were 100, 200 years ago. And there's definitely a place for small-scale growing for people to do at home, in community gardens, in allotments. And I think that can actually provide a really significant contribution to this problem we have of food security and health and well-being. So this is the wall garden. I was head gardener here until last December. I spent 10 years, basically, we took an empty space. The garden was completely empty. It was a meadow used for just growing hay. And we created this garden over 10 years. And it was really astonishing how much food we got from this space. It is a big space, admittedly. We have 600 fruit trees. It's 8 acres, so 165 metres in one direction, 185 in the other. But we used it. Everything in the garden was productive, so everything we grew had a use. It was primarily to supply the cafe, so we'd feed 100 to 150 people a day in the cafe. My aim was to have something in the cafe from the garden every day of the year, and we managed that. But also we had 200 different products that had ingredients from what we grew in the garden. We sold our fruit and veg to the public, and that became really important. We actually made about a third of our income from just selling, cabbages, potatoes, apples, whatever. We had cut flowers as well, herbs. So it was, incredibly productive, and I find that hugely satisfying to take this space and use it to supply the local community and businesses. And I think what I'd really like to do is take the lessons that I've learned over that time and use them to help people grow their own at home. So we've started this Sufficient Orkney Food project. I think the website's been around for a couple of years, but we're only really just at the beginning of the process, and we want to use this website as a resource to connect up gardeners, to provide information on everything from growing your own to how to cook it, how to prepare things. So the whole picture from soil to plate, we want this to be a resource that can help people on the islands, and then potentially we can use what we learn on the mainland in even bigger projects. So the aims and objectives, our main aim is to help gardeners become more self-sufficient in their food production on the domestic level. So I think that's the main point of what we're doing, to reduce reliance on the global supply chain, which for you guys is even more important than it is for everyone else, because you're right at the end of the supply chain. And I think that all hit home to all of us during COVID, the first lockdown. There were those 2 or 3 days when the shops were completely empty. And I think that's when people realised that we can't assume that these things are going to keep turning up for us to go and buy at our convenience. And actually for me, it was, I think, enormously stressful for everyone, but I had one less bit of stress in that we had this 8-acre wall garden full of vegetables and my own garden full of vegetables. So I didn't have that worry of how am I going to support the family. I knew that we could do that. And I think that's a really nice thing to share with everybody. And then to help carbon capture, reduce food miles, which is obviously incredibly important. I kind of figure if we're going to teach people to garden and promote gardening, we should do it in a sustainable way. It's so basic, but I think it's so important to look after the soil, think about what input you're putting into the ground and the effect you're having on the wider environment. And then finally, to educate and support gardeners, and in particular to introduce the next generation to growing their own food. We had all sorts of different projects at the Walled Garden involving scout groups, kids with learning disabilities, the local primary school. And one thing I've learned is that young children, particularly primary school age children, have this affinity with growing. And they just love it. As soon as you get them out into the garden, you get them tasting the vegetables, sowing seeds. It's so important. And to get children interested at that early age is what they'll hopefully pick up on once they've gone through the wilderness years of teenagehood. As young adults, they might remember how important these things are. So that's something that I think is super important. And then I think it's worth just asking a few very basic questions. So why would you want to grow your own food at home? Why shouldn't we just rely on agriculture in the supermarkets? Well, I think it starts with healthy eating. It's so complicated knowing what to eat nowadays. There seem to be so many pitfalls about, processed foods, where your foods come from, what pesticides, what chemicals have been used. But if you grow your own food, you know exactly how it's been grown and what's in it. So it takes away all of that worry that you might be consuming something that's harmful for you. And of course, it tastes better. The fresher your food, the better. Saving money, I think that's become, every year that seems to become more of an issue. Food prices going up and up and up. I'm more aware of how much we're spending on our food than I ever was. And actually, now more than ever, it's become more economical to grow your own. I know seed prices and compost are all getting more expensive, but actually there's crops now that really are cheaper to grow yourself than they are to buy. Salads, for example. Salads are so easy to grow and so expensive to buy and so, damaging to the environment. I think everyone should grow their own salads. And of course, food security is very important. Homegrown produce just isn't vulnerable to all of these worries we have in the wider world. Fragile supply chains, extreme weather, terrible politics, I think it's, and having that peace of mind that you've got a little bit of resilience in the face of a changing world, I think that's such an important thing. And then physical and mental well-being. Of course, gardening keeps you fit. I think if I wasn't a gardener, I would definitely have even more of a weight problem. So I think it's getting people outside, getting connected to what they do, and also understanding. Once you grow your own, you really start to understand the problems and challenges faced by farmers, and it sets your standards much higher for the quality of the food that you buy, I think, once you've tasted freshly grown fruit and vegetables. And of course, combating climate change. I think, you know, there's all these really important issues, but we can do our own little bit at home and help us understand the process, reduce our carbon footprint, and even maybe help capture some atmospheric carbon, so we can make a bit of a positive difference there. So I think there's three main barriers to becoming more self-reliant at home, and there's a lot we can do to break these barriers down. Cost, a space to grow, and knowledge. You could add to that time and motivation, but they're maybe a bit more complicated, so we'll stick to these three. So how can we reduce the cost of self-sufficiency? I think there's three main parts to gardening that cost money: tools, compost and fertilisers, and seeds and plants. So we'd like to look into finding grants to provide schools and community gardens with basic gardening tools. They don't have to be expensive, and gardening tools tend to last a long time if they don't end up being chucked on the compost heap by mistake. Tool sharing schemes is a great way for people to just buy one set of tools and share them around. Compost and fertilisers. Since I'm now self-employed, so I work as a gardener and a garden designer, and I have to pay for everything myself. And I've spent the last 20 years using somebody else's money to buy all the stuff and having fun doing that. And now I'm really resentful at having to pay £8 for a bag of compost, or 15 quid for some liquid fertiliser. So first of all, it starts with educating people on how to care for the soil. I think any good gardeners know that the secret's in the soil. So if you can look after the soil, you reduce the need to bring in fertilisers. But also teaching gardeners how to make their own potting compost. I don't know about you guys, but I've found the quality of potting compost has absolutely plummeted over the last few years. Unfortunately, a lot of peat-free compost just doesn't work. They haven't got the formula right. I've tried so many different types and really had disappointing results. But you can use your own soil to make your own compost. We only started using peat as an additive to potting compost in the 1970s. Prior to that, everybody made their own compost. A lot of the estates I've worked on had soil sterilisers, and you'd have leaf mould, you'd have loam, you'd have potash. You'd have all these different elements that you'd mix together and make your own compost. There's no reason why we can't do that. This year, all of my plants have been grown in my own garden soil with added compost and a few extra bits and bobs, and they've worked brilliantly. Apart from having to weed them out a little bit, which is annoying, it's worked fantastically, and I haven't bought any compost from the garden centre. But also, if people can't do that themselves, on a small scale, it is hard to do that, we could set up cooperatives to buy compost from wholesalers, get the price right down. And then seeds and plants. So it's a kind of depressing fact that gardening has this lovely wholesome image, but most of our seeds are imported from abroad, from just a handful of huge global seed companies. Even the ones you see in, Dobies or Mr. Fothergill's, they come all from all over the world, and that's a real weakness. So I think educating people on how to save their own seeds is a fantastic thing to do. And actually, it's quite a simple process. Some varieties are harder than others, but there's a lot you can do to save your own seeds. And then, of course, you can do seed and plant swaps. And then, as with the compost, we can set up cooperatives to buy seeds from wholesalers. So seeds seems to cost about £3 a packet at the moment. They've been going up about 10% every year for the last 4 or 5 years. But if you buy by the gram from wholesalers, you can end up paying about 30p for the equivalent amount of seeds as you buy individually. So I think setting up a cooperative, linking up all these different gardens, community gardens, growers, and buying seeds together is a great way of saving money. And then finding a sheltered place to grow. Sheltered is the most important thing up here. That's your biggest challenge. You know better than I do about that. But there's so many different community gardens on the islands. It's fantastic. So a lot of this work has already been done. But I think quite often it's telling people where they can go, communicating with people. What we'd like to do with the website is put a whole list of all the different community projects so people can talk to each other. I noticed polytunnels and polycrubs everywhere I go on the islands, but when you look closely, quite a lot of them have got nothing in them. So I think it would be great if people who've got a polytunnel that they can't manage or don't have the time for could rent it out to their neighbours or to people down the road, whatever. I think that would be a fantastic thing to do. So this next slide's quite an interesting one. So on the right-hand side here, you can see this is the really old-fashioned way of growing things. These are crews. A lot of you guys probably know about these. So this is the most northerly point of North Ronaldsay, and they're these amazing circular structures that would have been used to grow crops, almost like a small allotment. So it's a very simple principle. You just build a round stone wall about 1.5 meters high. These things are about 3 meters wide on average to provide shelter. And then, of course, there's more modern versions. This top slide is, again, Stromness Community Garden, where they've just put windbreaks up, and then very deep cold frames, and these wonderful hoop beds. So one of the problems with polycrubs, I think polycrubs are fantastic, but they are phenomenally expensive. I didn't realise quite how much they cost. But you can make your own version on top of a cold frame by creating these what do they call them? These little miniature tunnels on top of frames. And we can teach people how to do that. So what I'd really like to do is, on the website again, put up the basic instructions for these, and you can make one of these things for £50 to £100. It makes a huge difference to what you can grow. And then education. So there's a lot of gardening information out there, but I feel it's become rather trendy, and the depth of the information you see on a lot of gardening programs isn't great. And a lot of the time, I think we've moved away from that kind of productive self-sufficiency mindset, and it's a lot of the books that you read are more about ornamental gardening, or not really that kind of proper self-sufficiency. So we'd like to do a series of workshops and lectures. I did some last year at the Science Festival. I've got arranged this year. I came up in March to run an introduction to self-sufficiency at various different community gardens. And actually, if you get the timing right, it can make a huge difference. So most of the work in gardening is done in the spring. So April and May is when we're really busy. And if you can get people enthused and educated at that point, get them to put that energy in, it really reaps rewards later on down the line. We've created information sheets and videos, so sort of online resources that people can access. I'm running out of time, so I'll rush through. School visits, I think, are really important. I talked about that earlier on, and they're a lot of fun. Linking up gardeners and community gardens, I think, is super important. So what I discovered visiting various different sites is that these groups don't necessarily know each other, so we don't necessarily know who's doing what on the different islands, not necessarily sharing the information about what you can grow. So we'd like to create stronger links, and then experimenting with new varieties and gardening techniques. So we've run these wonderful rock dust experiments for the last 3 years, and we tried Orkney quarry dust with our crops this year, and at a blind tasting it won by two-thirds. The blind tasters chose the carrots that we grew with Orkney quarry dust as having a better flavour to the ones we grew without. So that's fantastic. Bit of citizen science. So I think it's really important not just to rely on technology as well. So what we'd like to do is create information sheets, physical information sheets that we can send out to people in the form of posters and worksheets, send out to schools, all these different groups, and not just rely on the computer and on phones. I'm kind of sick of my mobile phone, so I think it's important to keep it much simpler than that. And then I'll just wrap this up quite quickly. So it's also really important to create a market. I think that final link in the chain is getting your produce to people who are going to appreciate it. So I think there used to be a farmer's market in Kirkwall, and there isn't anymore, but it'd be wonderful to get that going again. Honesty box schemes, crop swaps, linking up with restaurants and shops so people really value what you're growing. I know that Shearers is great for local grown produce, but there's nothing in Tesco's at all. Perhaps I looked in the wrong place, but I couldn't see. They don't have locally grown fruit and veg in Tesco's, and the co-op didn't seem to have any either. And then providing crops to schools and food banks is really important. And then just to finish, because I'm out of time, this is my own garden. It's my little very scruffy plot, and at home I'm a very lazy gardener, so I spend sort of 40 hours a week gardening for other people, and when I'm at home I want to do it quickly and easily. And we've got about a growing space of about 80 square metres. Sounds a lot, but it really isn't. And from that, from June until September, we're completely self-sufficient for our own vegetables. We spent about £150 on compost and seeds this year, and for a third of the year, we're totally self-sufficient for vegetables, just putting in probably an average of a couple of hours' work a week. And that's really significant. If everyone could do that, and I know that they can't, but if everyone can contribute a little bit, I think it really helps with the big picture. So anyway, have a look at Orkney Sufficient Foods and let me know what you think of my ideas. Great, thank you.
Gosh, there was so much in that. I'm going to come to the panel first. One question per panel member, to Henry and Ed.
Okay, this is a bit of a crowbar question with 3 parts. First of all, what acreage would be needed to supply Orkney with fruit and veg? You sort of said that it was capable of growing all kinds of different things. In a hypothetical situation, what space would we need? That's part A. B, what are the economics compared to, say, beef farming? And then C, just regarding the CEA stuff, what price of electricity does CEA become viable for different crops?
Shall I do the first one? Yes, the first. Well, first of all, I have no idea what acre, if you wanted to be completely self-sufficient. But taking it back to a smaller scale, I remember I've got a Victorian book called The Gardener's Assistant, and that said you'd need an acre of land to feed an extended family. But I think that's nonsense. I think you could do it quite happily on a third of an acre of land if you had a polytunnel, and that could include some small-scale livestock like chickens, for example, as well. So somebody will do the maths and probably tell me that that's way more acreage than you actually have. And I don't think that. I think it's really important not to try and aim to be completely self-sufficient. I mean, I wouldn't even want to be totally self-sufficient. I think it's trying to aim maybe to start off just for 10% of your own fresh fruit and vegetables would be a fantastic start and make a significant difference. So yeah, but the total acreage, I'm afraid I've no idea. It'd be a lot. Okay.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on people changing their diets as well. It's a really hard question to answer because people are not eating very seasonally, and as you get further north, it needs to be more in that direction. Onto the controlled environment agriculture. So in the system that we're putting in, the pumps which run the towers, you're only looking at a few volts, so we're using a small solar panel to keep that running. Obviously, when you add the lights on, that increases the costs a bit, but for the vast majority of the year, it'll be this system could be completely off-grid. And thinking about some of the barriers that Ed didn't really want to discuss, time and motivation. If you can reduce those and do it in an efficient space inside a polycrub, then I think uptake is going to be could be significant, particularly in the community garden sort of setting. There's lots of these polytunnels and polycrubs around, and yeah, as Ed said, not all of them are being used to their maximum capacity, and part of that is just that motivation and time. By having these towers or something similar, it takes a lot of the sting out of it and will encourage people into it, and then you'll see how far you can go after that. Sorry, there was another question in between, first and second, third part.
How do economics compare to, say, something like, more traditionally Orcadian, like beef farming?
Yeah, I suppose the land that we're going to have veg production is perhaps not as significant as the land that's suitable for grass, so it would have to be more localised. But if you're selling locally and retaining some of those profits and talking about some of the things that Ed mentioned about sort of protecting yourself from volatility in price, I think it would be, and there are a few people doing it, just part of the reason that it's not taken up is, as you mentioned, pushback from the supermarkets that are they're buying based on price rather than locally sourced. So thinking about when you are buying meat, is it locally produced? Dairy, is it locally produced? And then thinking about your major carbohydrate source as well. Most people would have had wheat today or at some point today. It's very hard, near on impossible to get bread-making quality wheat in Scotland generally, and less so here. People to switch to more resilient crops that grow in these environments like oats and barley and potatoes, then that's a significant burden sort of taken off that sort of wheat demand. So I think that was it.
I felt like 3 questions in one, but...
So just thinking generally about your talk and stuff like this, in the past we were self-sufficient, we did grow a lot more food. We've moved away from this over time, and now you're suggesting that we move back. Why is this the time to move back to self-sufficiency, and why did we move away?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think not just on Orkney, but the whole of the country has moved away from growing their own, probably, presumably since we were pretty good at it in the 1950s and the 1960s into the 1970s, but I think we've got a bit lazy, to be honest, and there's so many distractions nowadays, particularly for the sort of next generation, for my children's generation. There's so much else that you can do. The kids are never bored, they're never looking for something to do. There's so much you can do sat on your bum staring at your phone, and also we've got really used to having whatever we want whenever we want it, so completely out of season crops. I'm as bad as anybody for buying soft fruit in particular way out of season, and it's so it's harder, isn't it? I mean, it's just harder for us, but I think now's the time to do it. I think just the last sort of 5 years or so, with the rise in food prices and the rise in awareness of this fragile system that we've created, I think people are looking for some reassurance, and taking matters into your own hands can take away a lot of the stress. The world's so complicated, we've got so much to worry about nowadays, but knowing that you can feed yourself is such a simple instinct, and it's I think it is a really good time to do it now, because I think people want it now more than they ever have done. Maybe it's just because the people I talk to are the kind of people who enjoy gardening, but and I think there's a move away, there's a bit of a rejection of all the excitement of new technology, and there is a resurgence in the people valuing decent quality food. Traditional skills and crafts are certainly coming back. So I think there's a lot of demand for it. Yeah, hopefully that answers some of your question.
I had one maybe more for Henry, but please. do, Ed, if you can contribute. Are you looking at solutions to the water shortages that we're increasingly facing here in Orkney in what you're doing right now? Obviously, looking after the soil's a vital part of that, but I would say that this is a more recent change that traditional practice alone won't solve.
So we don't really grow winter-sown crops in Orkney, which is quite good from inputs, including water. We focus on spring crops, generally lower input. The cover crops and other techniques like that are really good for improving soil structure, soil quality, soil strength, and that allows us to absorb some of these shocks that we might have, droughts and floods, by maintaining an average of about 50% air within the soil. So investing more in improving organic matter in the soils, through farmyard manure and green manures as well, is a way that we can sort of deal with some of these issues. Moving to more horticultural sort of systems, if that was to be done on scale, then we're perhaps more susceptible to these sorts of issues. Before I moved up here last year, I was in the east of Scotland, in around sort of Edinburgh, Fife sort of area, where there's a lot of veg grown and a lot of problems with water scarcity. It's probably less of a problem for us here, I would say.
Sorry, I'll just like to, I think you said that maybe traditional techniques can't necessarily help with these things, but I think you're wrong with that. I think actually a lot of them can. And what Henry was saying about looking after the soil makes an enormous difference. So at the walled garden, we used to have to water. We get a drought every year. There's average 20 inches of rain in Murray, on the Murray coast where we were based. And we'd have to water a lot, and it was a real drag. The only part of the garden that we didn't have to water were the vegetable plots, and it's because we got the organic matter so high, and we would mulch as well. So we got very few plants bolting, and we had very few problems with the vegetables for watering them. And also, again, the benefit of small-scale self-reliance is these problems become a lot easier to deal with. So you can use things like water butts. You can put membranes down. So I think it's much more complicated. With the more complicated you get, the more technological you get, the harder these things are to solve. But yeah, okay.
And I was just going to ask about, in this Orkney context, why is developing resilient crops and resilient methods of growing food so important? Is that to do with changing climate? Is that the way that we've farmed in accordance with policy stimulus? I don't know if you have any idea about, why we need these resilient crops kind of in the first place.
Yeah, so part of the reason is the changing climate. We're also looking at areas where we might be able to expand the sort of true crop growing area. So that's looking at more marginal soils and things like that. The oat project is looking to sort of, as they expand the range of oat production right the way up to Lapland sort of area. And we can't do that without effective breeding programs. So we do work a lot with plant breeders to achieve those goals. Sorry, there's another part to your question.
So is that because the crops that we have been growing are no longer viable? Like why, just a bit deeper in that.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason, as I mentioned before, a lot of the varieties that we have available in the UK are being bred in the east of England, which is not ideal. They're been selected for high input conditions in those regions. So when we grow them up here, they typically don't work as well as they would down south. I mean, Brexit has created some issues in terms of movement of seed between other partners we might be looking to get new varieties from, but they're not insurmountable, and we've done it this year. So I think we need to make sure that we've got some kind of decentralised programme for assessing varieties and potentially breeding them going forward, rather than relying on anything that's been bred and adapted for elsewhere.
Thank you, panel, and thank you both for answering the questions. I'm going to take one question from the floor, and it's first hand up. and then we're going to have a little vote.
Thank you. I've always been a very keen vegetable grower, but from where you guys are and look at the audience looking at you, Orkney is an ageing population, and keen growers though we are, it's damned hard work. And I want to ask you whether we're really right to concentrate on the individual grower, or whether we need to create jobs in horticulture to be growing in a joined-up way to give us the crops we want throughout the year. Yes, it requires a change. You know, we don't necessarily need blueberries the whole time. But I would just like to say, do you think this is realistic? You know, there are days when I can't get a spade in the ground. I understand boulder clay since I've been in Orkney. It's mainly boulder.
Yes, no, I totally understand your point, and as I get older, I start to think, why am I doing this? Yes, I do think it is totally realistic, and again, it depends what you're aiming for. So I'm not saying that we should all be completely self-sufficient. I just think it's trying to become more self-sufficient, trying to understand the food growing process is really important. But absolutely, yes, we do need more jobs in horticulture. There's my local, the UHI branch in Murray has been oversubscribed this year on their horticulture department. So there is a real interest in younger people for this. But I think gardening clubs and community gardeners need to change their attitude slightly. So whenever I've given talks to these various clubs, it does tend to be retired people who are getting older. And the focus quite often is not on the same things that younger people want to do. Quite often it's sort of quite old-fashioned bedding plants, showing vegetables, that kind of thing, whereas actually the younger generation tend to be more interested in what I'm talking about, in self-sufficiency, feeding their family healthily. But I think, yeah, I think we need both. You know, it'd be lovely to see market gardens coming up again, but economically it's incredibly difficult. So at the Wall Garden, we made about £35,000 a year from the crops that we grew. The garden cost about £120,000 a year to run. We had the advantage that we had a cafe and we charged for admission to make up the shortfall. But I don't know what the answer is economically, because it is incredibly challenging. So, yeah, but we should be pushing in that direction. Yeah. Lovely.
Thank you. And we're out of time, and we're committed to finishing on time. So I can see that lots of hands went up when I said audience questions. So I think there's going to be an opportunity, if you can stay behind for some questions. Yes. And we're going to take those at the back, if that's okay, so we don't have people in the room off to the side rather than people coming forward. So I know lots of hands went up. In a moment, I'm going to ask the panel to give us a green, amber or red. But before we do that, can you, in one sentence each, so one sentence, just summarise your recommendation?
Support Orkney growers.
Yes, I don't think I can do much better than that, to be honest. My recommendation is that we need to provide education and financial support to individuals and small-scale community gardens.
I'm going to invite Alexander to be the chairman of the panel.
Right, okay, here we go. So I thought that was incredibly interesting, and coming from a farming background, it was quite good to hear the panellists talking. I was really interested about hearing the research and development that was going on, and I'll probably pester them for stuff I can plant on my farm. I think the panel completely agrees it's a green vote from ourselves. We definitely should go ahead with this and help with the education and all of this, mainly just basically because it would be good for folk to experience how blinking hard it is for folk to grow food. Thank you.
I'd just like to finish with a massive thank you to Henry, Ed and our panel.